class.
Here they are. This is what's called the Brady Bunch moment. They're all right here.
There
We
you
have no
go.
Jans or Marcia this year, though, Alan. It's all
Oh.
Greg's and Peters and Bobbies.
That's what I've been telling people with online groups is if it's bigger than the Brady Bunch, it's too big
Right.
for an online group.
Yeah. And that's actually one of the things that I've been teaching them as well. My breakout rooms, I limit to 3 or 4 screens. You know, once you get 5 screens, or I'll let a 5th person in if I have to, but once you get to 6, I'll have 3 screens in each. But that's how I built my my Zoom groups, and they really develop community if you keep it small like this. So this here is the max for me, is 6 screens. Yeah.
There you go.
So, well, guys, I want to welcome you to another edition of Zoom Friday, small groups, effective small groups. But let me introduce you to Alan White, all the way from South Carolina. You said, was it Greenville, you said?
Greenville, yeah.
Greenville, South Carolina. And Alan White Consulting, that's his business, and he works with churches and, of course, deals with small groups and is an author, as you should know by the 5th week of this class. Hopefully you've been reading his book, you know, and yeah, I know you have, and you've actually had a lot of good things to say. So welcome, Alan, and everybody else here to today's session on effective small groups. In particular, we're going to be looking at, see if I can get this to go. This is a problem with
the ghost book.
There we go. Exponential Groups by somebody named Alan White. That's you. Yeah. And to kick us off, Alan, actually what I want to do is read from your preface here, or your forward, because I thought this was interesting. And you're really quoting True Spirituality, which is another book you wrote. But I think it's a great way to kick off what we're talking about this week, and that is healthy groups. And one of the things that that we've kind of been hitting on is, and I think Joseph Myers helped us with this as well, even though this class is called small groups, I think we're realizing that groups can be any size, and it's about healthiness and creating authentic community. So let me read to you what Alan wrote in the preface, and probably you read it as well in the forward. Actually, he says, quote, "Small groups are a means. Authentic community is the goal. Authentic community is powerful. Authentic community is something we all long for. Authentic community goes way beyond simply being on a team or being part of a club. Authentic community occurs when the real you shows up and meets real needs for the right reason in the right way." I like that. It's when the love of Christ is shared and exchanged with vulnerability, sacrifice, and devotion. It's a place where you can just be who you are and be loved in spite of your struggles, hangups, and idiosyncrasies. It's basically like that old song Cheers, a place where everybody knows your name, right? So Alan, unpack that for us, and feel free to transition into a brief outline, although they've read and are familiar with exponential groups, but just unpack this idea of community, and especially authentic community, for us.
Yeah, I'm like, cheers, Rick. Geez, how old are you?
I'm senior minister old.
See, I'm trying to stay young and hip, so I throw out things about, you know, where gamers find community online and Twitch. How do you make small groups out of that? And I only know Twitch because I have a 15-year-old. He also explained WandaVision to me. So you were like, I don't understand WandaVision. I said, you need a 15-year-old. But anyway, and I do have to say one other thing about my friend Joseph Myers. I wrote the most popular review for his book on Amazon that's called "Why I Hate Joe Myers' Book."
Why?
Oh, it messed with my head. Because, you know, I thought my job was to recruit these leaders, make sure that they were, you know, they were qualified, and then I would get all these people that wanted to be in groups and then place them in the right groups so we get to keep the troublemakers apart. And, you know, that's kind of what I learned. And then each group develops an apprentice, and then the apprentice, you know, will birth a new group. And I discovered that doesn't work so well in the US. It works pretty good in Korea, but not so well here. But anyway, So Joseph Meyer's book messed with me. I was reading out loud to my wife. We were on vacation over at a place outside of Salinas. And I said, listen to this guy. He said, my pastor announces that we're not going to be a church with groups. We're going to be a church of groups. And then Joseph Myers says, and once again, I realized I'm going to be subjected to forced relational hell. And my wife says, exactly. And I said, wait, I said, you can't say that. You're married to the small group pastor, right? And so I started, unpacking what this book was saying. And that's what led to the first sentence of my book is that everyone is already in a group. And so to Joseph Meyer's point that most small group guys are working way too hard because we're trying to take people away from their friends, connect them with a group of strangers and say, fall in love with each other, become best friends. And if they show up, if the leader contacts them, if they even like each other, that might happen. Or you could just fast forward and find the groups that people are already in, their friends, their families, their coworkers, their neighbors, give them something intentional to do about their spiritual growth, draw a circle around them and say, you're a group. So I'm not personally recruited a small group leader since 2004. And I served a church in Northern California near Modesto in a town called Turlock. It's not a vacation spot. And and they know that, but it's 2 hours from Monterey, it's 2 hours from Yosemite, not so bad. But I served there for 15 years. And then I served this church in Greenville, South Carolina. It was a church of about 6,500 that I served for 4 years. My last 3 years in Turlock, my 4 years in Greenville, I did not recruit one small group leader. And the pastor put out the announcement. Now I prepared them, I briefed them, I got them a coach, we developed curriculum, all of that stuff. Then the people, invited their friends into a group, and that's how we got it started. And it wasn't lowering the bar for the sake of, we've got to have big numbers, so let's let everybody in. It was more for the sake of most people don't consider themselves to be any kind of a leader. That's right. So I saw this idea of doing a church-wide series as, get together with your friends and do the study as the first step in a leadership development process. Because if they have what it takes to gather a group, John Maxwell says leadership is influence. So if they have what it takes to gather a group, they have more leadership ability than they give themselves credit for. And then we invite them into a second study. And if they do two, then you say, we have this leadership training that might be helpful to you. Or we have a growth track. Have you been through our growth track? And you start out by invitation, and you just kind of bring them along. And before you know it, they're leaders. They've met all of the qualifications that you've delayed. And this is what we did at your church with the Hope Rising series. And I mean, they had, 700 groups or something ridiculous like that at the time. And then Will came in and killed it all, I'm sure. But anyway, I'm just playing. But
Will's gonna see this tape, I'm sure. So
there you go. Well, I'm controversial. But the issue is that when you think about inviting people to lead, the conversation frequently goes, hey, have you ever thought about being a small group leader? Oh, I'm not a leader. Well, if you come to our leadership training, we can teach you how to lead a small group. And they're like, didn't I already tell you I'm not a leader? Why would I come to leadership training? You've had this conversation. Philip's had this conversation. I know. And so to me, it's like, okay, let's start them in a comfortable place, invite the people that start with that. Now, there's a safety to this. I don't throw caution. I've done this before in kind of chaotic, reckless ways. So now we have organized chaos. I give them the curriculum. And there's a video to it. So I determine what gets studied in the group. But also I make it easy for them. They don't need to be a Bible expert. They don't need to be a Bible scholar. The experts are pastor, or the experts, the curriculum we bought. And I don't want them teaching in the group because they might be teaching something weird. So I determine what curriculum they're going to study. I give them an experienced leader to walk alongside them. answer their questions, encourage them, pray for them, keep an eye on them. And then if I don't know them, then we do a group that's called invitation only. So you invite 100% of the people to your group, and we don't advertise your group. Because once I say, oh, this, here's a list of all the groups that we're offering this semester, we put it up on the website. Well, now we have an implied endorsement, and if I don't know these people, it's gonna make a mess, and I've committed that mess before. But if I don't advertise them initially, and then as I'm bringing them along, then that's tended to work a whole lot better. And then we can, I just kind of do a lot of on-the-job training. I don't train them to death. I mean, I don't know where we got this idea that if we sit people in rows and lecture them, like I'm lecturing you, that, it's all going to sink in and they're going to do exactly what we said. But it's more of, if you have a coach that's getting to know the heart of that leader, then you know what's going on in that group. And I'll end this rant with this, and that is that I had a guy at our church in Turlock that came up to me and he said, "Thank you, Pastor Allen, for showing me I was the leader I never knew that I was." And so again, it's not just a matter of, oh, I got frustrated handpicking leaders and connecting people to groups and did that for 7 years and, got 30% of my church connected and it was like banging my head against the wall. It wasn't just that. It really was going back to the Great Commission to go and make disciples. And there's no believer that's exempt from the Great Commission. So yes, we're getting a lot of leaders, and yes, we get high percentages, and yes, we can put on a webinar and write a book and sell all that stuff to people. But more importantly, we give our people permission and opportunity, and we're helping them to live in obedience to the Great Commission. And if we could have more of our people walking in obedience without fearing, oh, this sounds like evangelism, I think we're better off if more of our people are walking in obedience to God's word all the way around.
So kind of circling back around on this idea of authentic community, what does that look like in the actual group? What's authentic community look like? Well,
I think it's, people that like to be around each other, but I think it's also, it's people that are a good influence on each other. So I was having a conversation with a pastor. They're in North Georgia, kind of between here and Atlanta. And she says, well, what about, if certain people volunteer to do this? And I said, I joke from, crazy people have a unique ability to minister to other crazy people. I said, but where you live, I said, it may be more like crackheads have a unique ability to minister to other crackheads. And she's like, no, that's exactly what I'm concerned about. So I think it has to be the right group. And so it's almost like, and I get this from when I went to Fuller for a couple of classes. I'm a doctor of ministry dropout, but anyway, I took 2 classes. So one was with Archibald Hart, which was tremendous. The other was with Gareth Eisenogle about small groups. And he talked about the parable of the soils in terms of community. And so you have, the good soil, the thorny ground, the weedy ground, the hard ground. And he talks about in a group, if you have this combination of soils that, you may have good soil in there, but it may be the other soil that's kind of keeping them from growing. And so how do you become more of an influence on that? How do you become a better influence on that? And I think part of it is you just have to grow everybody up. You maybe start this whole thing off very simply, but you have to invest in the leaders, grow the leaders up, and then you grow the group up. Now, the way that I grow the group up, when I talk about discipleship, the word I don't want to use is process or pathway, because it sounds like manufacturing, and people don't come to us as raw materials, and we're not putting out a uniform finished product. That people come to us a lot of different ways, and they end up having different gifts and all of that. But in this, how do we create an environment where people are going to grow? And of course, Mike Breen is a genius on talking about disciple-making environments. But how do we set the tone? Well, a lot of times the way that we set the tone is in the curriculum. And so the curriculum is kind of two things. One is taking God's word and how do you apply it to your life. But the other part of the curriculum, and I learned this from Brett Eastman at Life Together, was you direct the group in what they're to do through the curriculum. So that could be everything from, the first week, hey, if you know of anybody else who would enjoy or benefit from this study, why don't you invite them, bring it back next week? Or you get the group to share all of the responsibilities, the refreshments, hosting the group, leading the discussion, and you build that into the curriculum. So it's not a matter of, oh, the leader went to training and learned all this and wrote it down and remembered to do it in the meeting. It's a matter of you produced your own curriculum and you're telling them and the whole group what to do in the curriculum. So that's one way to do it. The other thing is that as you're having a discussion of God's word, you get to the end, you challenge the group to set a goal for themselves or to take on an assignment for the coming week. And it may take more than the coming week, depending on what it is. It could be starting a good habit. It could be forsaking a bad habit. It could be any number of things. And then maybe you partner them up so they have somebody to check in with each other during the week, encourage each other, support each other. Then the next week, one of the first questions in the meeting is, last week you took on an assignment. Last week you set a goal for yourself, report your progress back to the group. Now, maybe it's the fact that I'm 56 years old, but if I don't write studies where people are going to say, wow, that was really good. I can't wait till next week. I mean, forget that. What I want to see is, how do we live it out? How is it changing our attitudes? How is it changing our action? Because so much of discipleship we think has to do with knowledge. Now, if in some scenario we get to heaven, St. Peter's there with a Bible Jeopardy board, and we have to pass Bible Jeopardy in order to get into heaven, but there is no Bible Jeopardy in heaven. So we have this knowledge. Now, don't get me wrong. God gave us a book and God gave us a brain. And that's not a coincidence. But then the other thing is, and it's not because I live in the South. I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in Kansas. I went to school in Missouri. I spent almost 20 years in California, North and South, and now 14 years in South Carolina. And what I see is there are a lot of people that go to church that outside of church, you wouldn't know who went to church and who didn't. Because, they're, just read the newspaper and you see what people do, especially in the South and the Bible Belt. And, they're abusive and they're racist and they're doing horrible things. And it's like, I don't understand. All this church going is doing exactly what? But in the South, especially, they're two religions, church and college football, and not necessarily in that order. Yeah. So go Tigers, Clemson, not LSU. But anyway, my basketball, I still go Jayhawks. So I'm just that way. And baseball, I still go San Francisco Giants. So, I'm a mixed. But anyway, people, now you guys are in a part of the world that you don't have that. It's not part of the culture for people to go to church because, everybody goes to your state to go on vacation. Yeah. Right. So there's plenty to do in California. Yeah. I knew people in Turlock, which, Turlock is a little backward, but I knew people in Turlock who had never been outside of the state of California because they didn't see any reason, or they didn't even understand what the rest of the United States had to offer, because California has it all. You can snow ski one day and surf the next day. So, you can't do that in Kansas. You can't do that in South Carolina. So you guys, there's a different reason that people come to church, but the bottom line is this. What are people taking home? What are people living out? And even to do a simple exercise, there's some very elaborate growth assessments that you can do, and they're very good. But even if you took a simple growth assessment like the fruit of the Spirit, and as a group or as an individual sat down and asked yourself, am I more loving today than I was a year ago? Am I more joyful? Am I more peaceful? Am I more patient? Am I more self-controlled? And go right down the list. And for most people, they're not going to stop and take an evaluation. And for the other, from year to year, I mean, as long as we're kind of like checking off certain boxes in our spiritual growth, we pretty much think we're okay. Because if you're too spiritual in church, it's like, whoa. And then if you're like doing stuff, then you're like, you know, that's the other end. But if you're right in the middle, kind of keeping your head down and part of the crowd, nobody's really going to question what's going on. But what's your next step? Right. What's the thing that you need to be working? What's the thing that you're convicted of? What's the thing that, you know, is taking away from who Jesus wants you to be? But what's also the thing that's going to help you move forward into becoming more Christ-like? And so those are things I think you could build it into curriculum. I think a lot of it you build into expectations and seasoned leaders so that they know, don't avoid the tough questions, don't avoid the hard things. Don't be afraid to hold people accountable, because if we don't hold people accountable, and I'm not talking about in a legalistic, heavy-handed way, but if we don't ask people what kind of progress they're making, we don't ask them, oh, how did you do with your goal, you know, last week or whatever. What we communicate by not holding people accountable is this really isn't that important. And the reality is, what is more important than what we're doing, right? All right, I went all over the place, Rick. I don't know if I'm helping or
Actually,
not.
that was a great. I almost wanted to take. We might need to take up an offering at this point if you do the conclusion correctly.
As I sing, I surrender all.
Yeah, sing "I Surrender All." We all just join in and sing the song, and the offering.
There you go. I see that hand.
I see that hand. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, let's open it up to the gallery here. They've been reading your book, and just so you're aware, and these guys, this is a great opportunity to ask some questions even about your group, you know, because part of the assignment, the major assignment in this class, Alan, just so you're aware, is they have to create a small group, or a group. It has to have at least 6 people to start, can be bigger than that, but at least 6 people. And they have to do for 4 weeks. And right now, I think you guys are in week 2. So last week was your first week. So they've got 4 weeks of small group that they've developed. So they may be asking questions about practical stuff. And, you know,
so
I know
you're doing small groups in a seminary class about small groups. That is so weird.
I know. Isn't that amazing? I got that idea from a seminary down in South Africa, that it was a evangelism type of seminary, and they required every one of their students to win somebody to Jesus before they could graduate. So
wow,
if you didn't win somebody to Jesus, they didn't give you a diploma. So I thought, hey, you know what? That's not a bad way to handle all my classes. Let's just make it.
I've been in the seminary for 65 years.
Yeah. It's kind of scary. All right. I don't know what happened to Trev. Maybe the rapture happened to Trev. But
he went to the banyo.
Left behind. What do you got a question, comment? Just jump right in there and ask away.
I'll ask a question. I like what you said about the living out principle, kind of an essence of, hey, what's the point in meeting if we're not? Do you have anything that you've found in your experience of how do you make those goals practical? How do you stop the person who is hard on themselves from saying, hey, we talked about generosity, I'm going to sell my house next week? Like, how do you stop the person that makes the unrealistic goal to the person who every time is like, oh, I'm just going to keep the same goal of, I'm still trying to pray once this week? Like, how do you see that? Is that something that you just say, hey, surrender that to the Spirit? You mentioned accountability. So kind of how do you see those play out practically in a group?
Yeah, those are good questions. I think the one on the person that wants to sell their house, I would, you know, take them back to the account of Ananias and Sapphira, just heads up. But those are very good questions, because I think the biggest problem with discipleship is that most of us have not been adequately discipled. And there's some great, resources out there, from, Mike Breen to Jim Putman, up in your neck of the woods, Rick, to, quite a few others that you can take that way. I think that one of the things, I actually borrowed this from somebody who was in a group that I did a couple years ago in Michigan at Radiant Church. And they actually give kind of an aspect of pastoral care and spiritual direction, if you will, to their group leaders, in the sense of at the end of every semester, the group leader meets with the members individually and asks them, what is your next step? And so out of that, now they don't put it in the church database. They don't, they rely on the Holy Spirit to do some work here, but just that sense of even asking the question of what is your next step? What is the thing that, you're working toward? The other thing you could do with a health assessment is even look at your church's values and what are the things that you would like to see the result of your ministry. If a person comes in, they're brand new, they're far from God, they come to Christ at your church, that in what, not really time and not a process, but what do you want that person to become? And that might actually be a good question as a staff. So what kind of attitudes do we want to have? What does it look like in the terms of generosity, of time, talent, and treasure, of all of these different areas of their life, and then what are the mechanisms to help them reach that and begin to put those sorts of things into place. And then a lot of it too, I think you can build out through curriculum as a guide. Another person that would be good to look at is a friend of mine. His name is Brian Phipps, and he has a ministry called Disciples Made. Brian, Rick? Mm-hmm. And so Brian's interesting because he uses a lot of curriculum in what they do, and yet he talks about his approach being curriculum flavored, but the rest of it is the whole thing of outcomes and changing attitudes and actions. And he doesn't write any curriculum. He uses curriculum that's already developed. But I think there is that expectation that with the Holy Spirit present in your life, that we have the same power resident in us that raised Jesus from the dead. And then people get frustrated because on their own, you say, oh, okay, Lord, I'm sorry. I'm never going to do that again. I'm never, ever going to do that again. And then you do it again. Like, good grief, if the same power that raised Jesus from the dead is in me, why doesn't this work? Because James 5:16 says, confess your sins to one another that you might be healed. So we have to create an environment where people are willing to talk about what they're dealing with, and an environment that's accepting enough that we'll still love them and still accept them as they are. Now, usually when I'm doing a leader training, I joke with people and I said, now, if you're not ready to confess your sins to your group, then have you ever taken an Uber? Call an Uber. Confess your sins to the Uber driver. You're never going to see that driver again. And now you've had a practice. Then go talk to your group that can actually help you, that loves you. But
makes you want to sign up to be an Uber driver.
What's that?
Makes you want to sign up to be an Uber driver.
There you go. It would be, I think it would be a great evangelistic tool. And somebody, I'm trying to think who it is that talks about that. But anyway, I mean, because, people talk about everything. I talk about everything in my Uber, just like when you're getting your hair done, a haircut, you talk to your person about whatever. So, to be that. But I think that there is that thing of, again, not in a heavy-handed or legalistic way. I was raised in more of a legalistic culture, so I'm sensitive to that. But I think that idea that when people decide to be in your group, then they have given you permission to speak things into their lives. They've given you permission to get involved. And I think that, again, as the leaders growing up, we're not going to have these perfected leaders that come in to lead these groups. That's why we need coaching, not just to supervise the system, but as my friend Mark Howell says, the coach should do for the leader what you expect the leader to do for the group member. And so in that regard, everybody's growing. And in addition to that, we're all still growing. And, we continue down that pathway. And so maybe it's you take an assessment and then whatever the group needs the most of, then you focus on that. or maybe as a church as a whole, you have a theme for a year. Maybe it's a balance of curriculum of a book of the Bible and something theological and something practical, something spiritual disciplines or whatever. So I'm not giving you an exact thing because I don't think it's an exact thing. I have learned a lot from like Pete Scazzaro and his emotionally healthy stuff. I don't use his daily office book anymore, but I practice a daily office every morning. The other thing I've learned a lot from is the rooted curriculum that Mariners Church brought over from Kenya. And I worked with Mariners for about 18 months on developing their pastor training. But the fact that it's study, it's group, and then it's experience, there's something to that. Because you see in Jesus's model that before the disciples had spent a whole lot of time with them, he sent them out. And then they came back. And so there is a little bit of not just learning, but experiencing things, of debriefing. The other thing that's significant about Jesus's ministry was he spent 75% of his time with his disciples and only 25% with the crowd. So, I mean, he fed 5,000 men plus women and children. Jesus could have had a mega church if he wanted to. And, but he spent his time with his disciples. And then that's how the church is as it is today from those disciples. So I think, how we invest, what we ask, what we talk about over and over and over and over again, till we're sick of hearing ourselves say it. And then people are starting to just get it for the first time,
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Good question there, Stephen. Thank you very much. Philip, Jeff, this is your opportunity. You had something?
Yeah, I think what I wanted to add on my end, I love the point you made in terms of getting members of your group to set a specific goal for the next week or the week prior, or whether that's a month prior as well. So if you're in a situation where you're setting goals or you're getting your members to set goals, and for whatever reason you notice one or two specific members who are just being completely like nonchalant about it, participation is not really there, they're just kind of joining for joining's sake in that sense. As a leader, how would you properly like deal with that situation, right? Because obviously, like, it's great that they are joining, but in terms of them experiencing their own spiritual growth, like, it's not there just yet, even with setting goals. So how do you kind of go about dealing with members like that in your experience or your opinion?
I think if their behavior is taking away from the group, then that has to be addressed. Now, if they're just there because they have to process this, they're thinking about things, they're, being there is a step for them as opposed to where they used to be, then sometimes we, I hate to say this, but it's a reality. We just have to be patient with people. I mean, if I could have the role of the Holy Spirit, people will be straightened out like that. Come on. And but that's not my job. And sometimes you see people that they don't listen, they don't take advice, they don't take coaching, and they go their own way. And then you just have to give them to the Lord. But I think that's the other thing too, is sometimes we get caught up in strategy and we can't forget prayer. And so we have to, we have to pray for the people in our group, and we have to pray, and ask God how he wants to use us to influence them. And then begin, because we can make things very, very complicated. But complexity is the enemy of execution, right? So, how do we keep it simple? How do we keep it basic? Almost like growing plants. And I don't have a terribly green thumb, but all plants need water and nutrients and sunlight. They need it in different amounts. So if we look at all of our people in our group, they're not all, they're not all fast growing, plants. They're not weeds. They're not cacti. They're all different. And so they will grow at different rates at different times. The other thing is, sooner or later, everybody goes through something. So in our church up in Turlock, we were trying to talk about what's the best catalyst for growth. When was a time in your life you felt you grew the most spiritually? And for everybody at the table, we came back and said that the time we grew the most spiritually was when we were experiencing a significant amount of pain in our life. And I said, well, gentlemen, I think we've hit on an effective catalyst. I think we're going to have a very difficult time marketing this to our congregation. You know, well, welcome to the pain method of discipleship. But one of the things I did learn that was equally as effective from Kenton Beashore and Mariners was that what works as well as pain is risk. So what's a risk? A risk is, going back to the rooted context, a risk is a 2-hour prayer experience. A risk is serving the poor. A risk is going on a mission trip. So what are the risks that we can take? Because when we take a risk, and I see this with people stepping out for the first time to gather a group, you know, they study the lesson more than they've ever have. They pray more than they ever have. And then God uses them. And it's like, oh, that fits together. That works. And, you know, a lot of the times, I think in some of our best efforts to make sure people are prepared, I think we handicap them in a way. I mean, you look at the book of Acts, and the Apostle Paul was in a city for, by my count, anywhere from 6 to 18 months. And then he appointed the best and brightest as the elders. And he said, I have to go to the next place where the gospel's never been proclaimed. If you get in trouble, write me a letter. And he was gone. 6 to 18 months. So we think of, would we turn our whole church over? You know, and their churches were probably more like small groups than like our churches. But would we turn our church over to people that had only been Christians for 6 to 18 months? And it's like, well, they can't even finish their Master of Divinity by then. Come on. And, you know, but it's so, and I'm not downplaying education, Dr. Cromie, but, but on the other hand, I don't think we need to hesitate. I was working with a guy at a church in Rockville, Maryland. He was volunteer at their church in the small group and discipleship area. He'd come over from the Philippines. He works for the World Bank. And he was so frustrated by American Christians. And I said, well, what's the problem? He said, well, why don't they take this? Why don't they live it out? Why aren't they sharing it? And he's going on and on and on. I said, well, tell me how it is in the Philippines. Well, somebody comes to Christ and you say, okay, now you know John 3:16, go share John 3:16. And then they're like, okay, but what do I do next week? Well, next week we'll give you another verse and then you go share that one. So that's like all the education they have is kind of hand to mouth. They're sharing everything that they learn.
Right.
And I said, well, here's the problem in Rockville, Maryland, compared to the Philippines. And I explained the whole thing about the frog in the kettle to him. I said, you're trying to throw your frogs into hot water and they're all jumping out. So you have to start so something easy to do, something felt need, and then gradually, you know, turn up the temperature. And then we thought about, well, we're actually boiling our disciples. Maybe this is the wrong analogy. So anyway, but there is that challenge of we don't want to wait for too long. We don't want to wait, you know, until we have it all figured out. Even we've got to get people moving. Yeah. And part of the moving is the learning part we've got. But it's also then how is it changing in their thinking? Are their attitudes becoming more and more Christ-like? And then what does it say in their actions of being understanding of people, or, you know, at least asking people questions instead of writing them off as if they're a certain thing? You know, what is it about having personal conversations instead of saying, I'm going to straighten everybody out on Facebook today? Yeah, that's fine. And it doesn't work. So anyway, well, so does that help, Philip?
Yeah, that definitely does. Thank you.
Let me kind of ask you on this, because this is kind of a practical one for me. I've got a group that's been together more or less for 3 years now, and good group. We're a solid community. Last Friday night we gathered together and had a great time and such. But I just sense that we're just kind of stuck right now, and part of me wants to blame COVID, you know, because COVID's kind of disrupted everything. But part of me also is just going, God, what's going on? And then last night I was sitting here and watching my group and seeing them connect and commune and all that. And I realized that they're probably not as stuck as I think they are, first of all. But I don't know, any thoughts on that one, just for a stuck group?
Yeah, I think again, it would be, what standard are you measuring it against? And, because there are, places where people get stuck or they get into certain patterns and they need to shake it up a little bit, do something maybe a little different than what they've been doing. I find that, I feel like everybody needs to move along faster than they are, except for me. I have a lot of grace for myself. So sometimes it's just my impatience. But then it depends on what the group's going to. Like I had a group leader that called me one day and he was asking me about some obscure thing in a verse that I was going to have to go look up to give him the answer. And I thought, why in the world are they focused on this? I said, I'll be honest with you, I could find an answer for you, but I really think your group is just in need of a service project. And he says, I think you're right. So I think, kind of how do we develop well-rounded disciples, and how do the different aspects of our life inform us about our spiritual development? So, if I'm talking to someone and I get triggered by something and I overreact and my reaction is much bigger than what the conversation merits, what caused that? Where is that from? And then my marriage, my children, my friends, that their feedback and what they see in me, people that I work with, my physical well-being. I mean, all of these things, I don't want to use the word holistic because then that sounds new agey, but all of these things kind of inform us about our spiritual growth. And so obviously there are things that are can be very discordant, that you see somebody and you regard them in a certain way and they're knowledgeable and they have a certain personality and they seem easy to get along with. But then, at home, they're a disaster, or at home, they're a nightmare. Or, what's their reputation in the community? Or I know guys that are very sweet to people, other pastors out there that they know, but they are a nightmare to their staff. And it's like, okay, I understand having a tough boss. I've worked for tough bosses, but what does that inform us about how we're growing? So how do we kind of take that, to use a 90s term, a 360-degree evaluation of our spiritual growth? But more importantly, I think those things that trip us up, the things that we catch ourselves thinking or saying, and I think all that comes down to is having a group of people that love us, but they aren't impressed with us. And they have permission to speak truth into our lives. Yeah. And I've had people do that. I've had somebody pulled me aside one time and they said, there's this one word that you use that's very off-putting. And it takes away from, who Jesus wants you to be. And I was grateful that that person loved me enough to bring that up. And then I stopped doing it. Now, I worked with somebody else that was just a complete nightmare, and she had it out for me. And I mean, it was a rough environment. And I went to the boss and I said, hey, what are we going to do about this? He said, I don't know. Why don't you go talk to her? I said, honestly, I don't care enough about her to have that conversation.
Yeah.
I'm not saying follow that example, but anyway, but I'm saying, who are those people that are allowed to speak truth into our lives that we can be honest with? Yeah. And they can be honest with us, but we have to allow that. And so that goes back to an old saying in small groups, and that is speed of the leader, speed of the team. People will be vulnerable to the degree that you're vulnerable. And if you model that, then other people will follow suit, or they'll be more comfortable about sharing things because, okay, this is a place where we can talk about what we're dealing with and talk about stuff instead of, pretending to be better than we are for a while everybody else is. And then you have no idea that everybody else is as messed up as you are.
All right. Thank you. We've got actually about 10 minutes left, and we want to try and get both Trev and Jeff in here as well. So with a question or a comment, and Jeff, why don't we get you first? So what, you got anything you want to ask Alan?
So I just wanted to mention that, we talked about Jeopardy in heaven, and Alex Trebek is up there now, so he may be leading some Jeopardy games up there. I'm just saying.
They're all Bible questions, right?
Well, and I think that, the thing with Alex Trebek is he showed the one practical use of a philosophy degree.
Yes, yes, very true.
The one Pat Sajak, I think, is getting a little feeble because the other day he actually gave away the answer to one of the puzzles on live on the air.
Oh, really?
But the contestant didn't get it.
Well, Trevor,
okay. I just wanted to share that I love, in your book, you're talking about bringing up coaches and mentors, and the fact that you teach them to edify these people instead of just saying, oh, here's Joe, they're going to be calling you. Edification is something that's so often missed, and it's just so important. So I'm so glad you mentioned that in the book. Alan, I wanted to ask, with you coaching and mentoring so many different churches, what are some common objections that you get from the churches that you try to help them grow within small groups? And what are some of the ways that you overcome those objections? Yeah,
that's a good question. I'll see if I can come up with a good answer for it. Now, it's amazing that in the last 17 years, I've coached over 1,500 churches, which is just ridiculous. And even I have 8 churches in my coaching group right now, and I did a tally the other day, and those 8 churches represent 25,000 people. And that's just kind of, where I find myself. Sometimes I think, well, maybe I should go back and work at a church. And it's like, well, I'm actually accomplishing more here. I think some of the things, the frequent complaint from small group guys or other staff is, I can't get my senior pastor on board. And so I have to clue. Now, this is 31 years of ministry this year for me. So I was the associate pastor, I was the adult discipleship pastor, and then when I worked for a parachurch organization, I was the vice president. You see a theme here?
Yeah.
I've never been a senior pastor. So what I tell the guys that say, I can't get my senior pastor on board with groups, I say, well, here's the deal. It's your senior pastor's boat. So you need to get on board with your senior pastor. So what is your pastor passionate about? Because whatever your pastor's passionate about, there is a small group component that can align with that. So then when you look at something like this is not a prop. I just have it here. This is the 2020 megachurch report. You guys know this? I interviewed Dr. Warren Bird from the first episode of my podcast, the Exponential Groups podcast, back in January. That was a plug. But anyway, this report has 5 different things from spiritual intimacy to racial diversity in these mega churches that they study. They do this every 5 years. They did this pre-COVID. I asked them if he was going to do it post-COVID, and they said no. But they do it with the Hartford Institute. But on the small group piece, they found that, and this confirms transformational groups by Ed Stetzer and Eric Geiger. This confirms all the way back 30 years ago, Robert Wuthnow in Sharing the Journey. He was a professor at Princeton. People who are in groups attend more, invite more, give more, serve more, grow more than people who are not in groups. This study revealed that the churches, the mega churches in the study that had 60% or more in groups between 2015 and 2020, those churches grew by 79%. And the people in groups, and this was kind of a moment I had to edit out of my podcast because Warren's going through, no, wait a minute, I'm going to find it. Okay, I found it. Yeah, so what they discovered was people in groups gave 11% more than people who are not in groups. So for even math, let's say your church has a $10 million budget. You get everybody in groups, your giving goes up $1.1 million. That is a very nice raise for the small group pastor right there.
That also speaks
to you could afford to buy a home in Southern California, right? But anything that the pastor goes after, So evangelism, oh, that's a hard one. So we're members at New Spring. We've been online members at Saddleback this last year. We used to be members there. And so they want to do evangelism groups and teach people how to do evangelism. And I'm like, oh, this is not good. But they get 10,000 people in groups. And then as soon as it was over, people were like, thank goodness that's over and it's done. I was working with a church in New York about 10 years ago, and they wanted to do a similar series. I said, maybe instead of doing a curriculum on evangelism, maybe do a curriculum that's evangelistic. So it had a lot of stories, a lot of testimonies, a lot of the pastors' personal testimonies, and then gave a message of the gospel, and we used it as an evangelism tool. So whatever the pastor's passionate about, leadership, growth, worship, whatever it is, there is a way to tie small groups to that. So our first, after 7 years of banging my head against a wall, this is dating me, 2004, my pastor was passionate about the Passion of Christ. He was planning a series. He'd already bought advertising, and I walked into his office, again, associate pastor hat on. I said, Pastor Dave, what if we launched groups off the Passion of the Christ? He says, I think that's a great idea. Why did he think that was a great idea? It was his idea. It was already where he was going. I said, well, we need to do a video. We need you to be on the video to do the teaching. Now, this really dates me. I use my home video camera. We output it to VHS tape. Where was YouTube? Now I tell people, use your iPhone, put it up on YouTube, write some questions. There's your curriculum. But VHS tape. Every week we had a tape exchange that went on. He stood up on a Sunday morning and said, if you would be willing to gather your friends, we've created this curriculum for you. We'll help you get your group started. We doubled our groups in a day. Now, did you hear me say it took 7 years to get to 30%? We doubled in a day. 6 months later, we doubled again. Right. And so, again, tying that to the senior pastor. So then, the other objections, I can't find enough leaders. Well, you're looking for the wrong person. And so I used to lower the bar. I don't lower the bar. I delay the requirements. Paul says, don't be hasty in the laying on of hands. So then we had to go back and ask ourselves a question. Do you need a leader in order to have a group? Because Jesus didn't say go and make leaders. Jesus didn't say go and make small groups. Jesus said to go and make disciples. Well, what do you need to make a disciple? You need a disciple to make a disciple. So gather your friends. We'll give you the study. We'll give you a coach. We're not going to advertise your group. We're going to bring them along in the requirement. And then once they've proven themselves, guess what? Then we're going to call them a leader, right? And then placing people into groups. They don't show up, all this stuff. Well, you know what? If they invite people they already know, they already like, they'll show up. You just give them an excuse to spend more time with their friends. So I think all of those things, one pastor says to me, well, I don't know about small groups because I've heard churches with small groups, they cause a lot of problems. I said, I don't know that small groups cause a lot of problems. I think they reveal the problems you already have.
Right.
And that's when you need support groups and you need counselors and you need, all of that.
And that's
going back to the coaching thing. I've spent too many weeks already reading this little tiny book, but this is Bob Logan, Becoming Barnabas. It's a little tiny book. It's $8. What a ripoff. But it's on Amazon. But this is a brilliant little book. And so study this to learn how to coach. Give this to all of your coaches. Maybe Bob will give you a discount. I don't know. He's a good guy. But anyway, Becoming Barnabas, a ministry of coming alongside. But the big thing with coaching is when it's the situational leadership model. When the leaders are new, you give them more direction. As they grow, you ask them more questions. Yeah. You ask them about next steps. So, okay.
We got
1 minute left, Trev.
Yeah, we got about 1 minute left. Trev, quick question if you got it, and very quick answer.
What verse would you say is your key verse for spiritual growth in small groups?
That's a good question. Maybe Acts 5:42, if it says they met in the temple courts, they met house to house. And the idea of, I got this from my friend James Grogan down at East Lake, about the idea of taking your weekend into your week. So you hear something on the weekend and then you take it to your group and you unpack it, and then how are we going to live it out? And so I like that idea. So I don't know if that's the right verse or not, but I only had a minute to answer. So
it's a good verse. Good verse. Thank you, Trev. Yeah, it's amazing how quickly this time goes by. And I just want to say thank you again, Alan, for coming in. Yeah, the expertise that you bring, the willingness to serve not just these students at Hope International University, but also we're going to be putting this up at the YouTube channel. So it's as we're doing with the other ones, and that allow anybody could be watching this and getting some of the wisdom of Alan White, and it's good stuff. Alan, if someone wanted to get a hold of you, what's your website?
Yeah, it's alanwhite.org. So ALLEN, from the book, alanwhite.org. And it's not that I'm a narcissist, it's just that I'm not very original. But anyway. And if Will Johnson gets a hold of this and says, "Oh, that's a bunch of nonsense," remind him that Gene endorsed my book. So
and such. But again, thank you very much, Alan, and God bless
thank you
in your work. Bye-bye, guys.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.